Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 9 of the Lowdown on Low Code podcast. I'm here today, Ryan Duguid, joined by my co-host, Rob Koplowitz, and excited to jump into a broad range of topics around the low-code landscape and vendors and process lifecycle. Fresh off a plane from New Zealand, so trying to stay awake and alert. But Rob, great to be back on the show with you.
Yeah, welcome back, world traveler. It's good to re-engage in our ongoing conversation.
Fantastic. So, Rob, we've had a little bit of exploration of what's up in low code. We've had a set of vendors on now. More to come on that front. Looking forward to a couple that we've got in the bag waiting to be published. And I thought it was worth taking a brief moment, just you and I, spraffing like we do, to talk a bit about the landscape for low code. The different vendors, the different types of technologies, and who's using them, and what everybody's pitching for, and look at how people should be thinking more holistically about what technologies they're working with and when. And so, it'd be great to, that we've had a few vendors on, just get a flavor, like, how are you thinking about the vendor landscape and how the different categories are emerging or consolidating in the space right now?
Well, I think they're all expanding for sure. But, if I could sort of think about this the way we used to think about it, when we were publishing a lot of research on this topic, I kind of would think about it as a continuum. And we can argue this back and forth. So on the far left of the continuum, we'd always place collaborative work management, CWM, right? So the Asanas, the Smart Sheets, the folks that were really originally designed to help teams collaborate and work together more effectively in kind of project-based work potentially, but they're growing, right? And they're somewhat configurable, so you can start to build out some interesting things in it, and they're super easy, right? And they're right on your desktop. So those are very seductive. And then kind of next up would be what we would call the classic low code players, the folks who were really designed for business developers. So your old folks, QuickBase, I would throw them into that.
Yep.
KissFlow, maybe more on a workflow kind of perspective. Quixie, I think, is another one that would be interesting to throw into that. And then we kind of move into the ones that, or you could have a little help, or maybe required a little bit of help from the professional developers. So you start to get into the ServiceNows, you start to get into the Microsofts. I think Power Platforms, still falls into that category. Mendix, OutSystems, Appian. Obviously, we've had Mendix and Appian both on the show, and I think Nick and Malcolm we're pretty straightforward. Look, you have to have a little bit of training to use these things. They're not weekend developer tools. And then maybe an overlay of that, which is things that were process focused, right? So maybe Nintex on the left side of that, and Pega, IBM, Camunda type of folks on the right side in terms of, developer focus versus, sophisticated applications really being the focus. But I guess if I wanted to close this out, what I would say is all of these are merging, right? Everybody who's building these professionally, these applications are more aimed at the professional developer. They're trying really hard to enable the business developer. Those applications that were more workflow focused are really focusing on the development experience and data management. And then the other way around, right? The ones who are more data focused are increasingly adding workflow. So I get the sense that they want to cover as much waterfront as they can, and to be able to serve a lot of needs within a given enterprise. So it's big.
Yeah.
It's a wider, and that's just on the development side, right?
Well, I think it's interesting that the sort of capability arms race, right, is always how I used to think about it, where you would say, okay, what are all the parts of this? There's forms capability needed. There's workflow capability. You have to have a database now. Everyone has some flavor of database, even if it's just a two-dimensional spreadsheet-like alternative, right? So you're sort of progressively building up. And I think what's fascinating to me, I mean, you mentioned the collaborative work management category, that for the longest time, I don't think anybody really thought of that as being app-like in nature. And then out of the blue, you see these platforms like a Monday, a ClickUp, and an Airtable, I think in particular, that you can step back and say, like, that's an app. right? It's not a project thing anymore. I mean, there's people doing classic project work in it, right? And managing marketing campaign or whatever it happens to be. But more and more you're seeing, you know, structure coming into these environments. Like I used to always like tell people, like Trello to me was always the most fascinating alternative to workflow, and that it's a almost a stateful process, right? Like you define your states or your swim lanes with Trello lists, you move cards between them, you set up alerts on them. It's dynamic in nature, right? It doesn't have to be sequential. Things can move back and forward just by dragging and dropping. It's like super simple way to approximate some pretty sophisticated processes. So like
Super
that
intuitive,
side of it,
Brian. Like you and I get it,
right?
right? Right? Nobody's go learn BPMN and then come back and we'll model the process. It's like that's not how I think, right? That's not how I do
Yeah.
it. So basically, you're telling me I've got this product on my desktop, and it's basically this kind of model of moving cards around through a series of gates. I totally get that, 100%, right? So,
Yeah. Doesn't
and
have
it's on my
sophisticated
desktop.
business rules, but it,
Yeah,
it,
and it's
it
on my
does the
desktop.
job,
I'm going
right?
to build something pretty sophisticated in it, right?
Yeah. Which, so that gets, what, gets interesting to me on that front is you and I, we've talked a lot about sort of this life cycle and, maturity models and this type of concept. And that I often feel that the best way for people to get started is actually on a path like that, right? Because, the history of, to your point, BPMN and the history of heavy lifting process was we bring in consultants, we do this process excellence engineering exercise. And the old joke was by the time you've finished, the process has already changed, right?
Right.
And so this idea that you can start simple. Okay, let's model out our process in a Trello board, and if that's working, and we need to start to get an audit trail and business rules and more effective decisioning and escalations and reminders, then we can grow it up into some other technology along that way. So if we think all these things, every app sort of is solving some process problem, driving efficiency and effectiveness. Then, I know you've done a lot of thinking around the world of process mining, analytics, task mining. Like, how do you find the problems in the business? How do you prioritize which processes you should try to tackle, where you're going to get biggest bang for buck? Like, how, if someone's sitting thinking in the low code space, right, where their problem is, they think their problem's an app problem, right? Like, how do you start to leverage these types of technologies? I know you've worked with Solonis a lot in the past, right? And to figure out what to go do next, like what is the next app to build, and how much rigor should go into that?
I have this vision, and it might be like flying cars, right? I don't know if we're going to get there, right? I mean, at some level, we could, we have airplanes, right? And to me, there's this future in which something which is process mining like is accessible to me as a business user. I can start to peek in and see, where is the real friction that's going on in these processes, and is it related to the things that I'm doing in my job on a daily basis, and could I automate that away, right? Because I do have tools that I can potentially automate some of the issues away. I think just sort of given the complexity of where process mining is at the moment, it still sort of remains something that the process experts do, maybe the process owner of a really large critical process in an organization, is probably going to be in their domain for for the foreseeable future. But that's a great place to start, right? I mean, if I look at our critical processes and say, there are areas where the process is breaking down, and oftentimes it's areas that could, be aided by automation or aided by visibility, things where the process goes offline and people are using spreadsheets, people are using email, and then, bang, the process goes back online. Could those wait states be automated away? Could we look at that? That's an interesting place to start. But even in that instance, I would take it a step down and say, okay, below process mining, below task mining, below your kind of, your process analytics that are living within your process platforms, you've got this ability to think about re-engineering processes, right? And this doesn't necessarily have to come from process mining. ProMap, from Nintex, but iGraphics, Business Optics. There's a lot of folks in this space
Yep.
who do really
Is
good
Visio,
work.
right?
Sorry, Visio,
Visio.
Signavio, obviously.
Yep.
These are platforms which I really found the value to be collaborative, right? The value being we get a bunch of different stakeholders, which is not necessarily how we normally work. And we work together to establish a best process, right? It's being done differently across the entirety of the organization. They're doing it differently in Singapore than they're doing it in Berlin, than they're doing it in New York. And we need to come up with a common way that we do this. We need to bring it into a managed platform so it's visible, it's transparent, it could potentially integrate with larger processes. But you do that as a team, right? And you think about re-engineering the process and making it work better before you ever begin automation. If I could tell a short story, which actually relates back to your own employer.
Yep.
I think you were actually at the event where I heard this story. It was a construction company based out west, and they had a big problem of bringing contractors on site. It required 7 sign-offs.
Yep.
They brought in your tool, ProMap at the time. They went back to the legal department. They said, can we possibly cut back the 7 sign-offs required to bring a contractor onto a work site? And the legal department looked and said, we didn't establish any of these. You don't need any of these sign-offs. You don't need any. So it wouldn't have done any good to automate those 7 sign-offs, right? You're thinking about things in a much more holistic way. But that gives you a very good baseline for, should I automate? If I should automate, how should I automate? And then can I turn that into a virtuous cycle where I can start to track, did the automation work? Did it make it better? Did it make it worse? Generally, the answer is it made it better, but there's more work to be done. And if we think about it from that mindset, we get very quickly into a continuous improvement cycle, which is a good place to be.
Yeah, the interesting thing I always found, so if I look at process mining tools, to your point, like I think there's still this challenge of bring your experts, bring your data scientists, do a bunch of work, and then on the other hand, something is super simple. If you look at our goal with that ProMap acquisition, you look at what Ivan and Rich had aspired to over all the years, was just make it damn simple to get people together and to write down what they do without the complexity of all the details and the implementation. And is this state-based? Are there decision trees here? Are there, is there looping logic or whatever? But just like, what do you do here? And I always remember it's like at the back of the room when we went down to New Zealand to complete the acquisition and talk to the team about what was happening. And someone in the back of the room puts up their hands like, you guys do know not every process needs automated, right? So just capture it, document it, and then step back and say, okay, now what, right? Because that's a lot easier than investing tons of money in technology and potentially automating a process that's being done the wrong way or what have you. And it's also easier to fix, right? Like I was down in New Zealand working on chose to build a house, novel experience, right? And it's the exact same sort of thing. If you've got a sketch of their house, it's easy to erase lines and draw another lines, and a floor plan, you can add a room or what have you. If you've poured concrete foundations, it's not so easy to change. So when you think about, so you go through the documentation side of it, there's the discovery side of your processes and what have you. One interesting thing there is that you get into this world where you say not all processes are equal, right? They don't all take the same time, have the same impact, what have you. So then that starts to speak to how much energy and rigor do you invest in any one of them? Because you talked about, okay, you sort of maybe you automate it, then you start to measure it, then you look for improvement. So it's this continuous cycle, right? But like, how do you think about, like, when is a process done? Like, okay, we can park that when we've got as much out of it, or there's diminishing returns. And but probably more importantly, like if you go through this kind of exercise of looking at a portfolio of processes that run your business, like how do you pick, okay, which one next, and which technology is potentially the most appropriate fit to solve that type of problem?
I mean, I think it's 2 different questions, right? I think you have to focus on the business problem, right? First, and the problems, the things you address first are either the problems you're aware of, right? So, we know this doesn't work, right? Or we know that we're under competitive stress because our competitor does it better. Our competitor can issue you a credit card in 3.5 minutes on your iPhone device, and I still have to bring you into the bank. That's
right.
That's a pain process, right? Why are we still setting up card tables at student unions? is a problem, right? There are also areas where things like process mining or other types of insiders saying this is highly problematic, right? The European region is running these processes, through in 48 hours, and North America is taking 72 hours. This is a vast
Right.
difference. Something is being done differently. Something needs to be rationalized. So those are kind of like your big P processes that are going on, and I think we're reasonably good at having some methodologies and frameworks to kind of address those. I would almost argue that the real challenge lies in the little P processes, right? The things that I do on a
Mhm.
daily basis that I know are inefficient, and what do I have available to me today in order to make it more efficient? Well, I've got a spreadsheet and I've got email, right? And I've got the ability to put in a request to the IT department to automate this process. It's number 1,000. They're going to do 2 projects next year, right? So that's never going to
Right.
happen, right? That's the landscape I think that has changed significantly, right? So I take a documentation and modeling process and say, this is how we all do it, right? I'm a marketing person, and I'm in charge of running, multiple steps in a campaign. This could be automated away, right? We can make this process visible. We can do some basic integration, and make it easier for everybody. These are the little P processes, which suddenly, with the tools we're talking about, you can come to a common understanding of what the process is. You can actually, with minimal IT support, probably build out the process. And I kind of don't want to guess on those. I kind of want to say there's thousands of them, maybe as many as there are spreadsheets. That's probably crazy talk,
Yeah.
but on that scale, right? There are hundreds of potentially thousands of these things that are now up for automation, and you don't prioritize them as much as you build a governance model that allows people to be able to do the automation, do the process optimization on their own, and introduce it into the production environment with, obviously with certain gates and guardrails, etc. So, it's kind of the spectrum, right? Are we turning the aircraft carrier? Is that the sort of big P process that we're talking about? Or is it like aligning the 5,000 speedboats that say we all understand what our business is trying to do, and we now have the tools to be able to do that within this context and to make things better?
Yeah, always it's funny. I always do the analogy of the one thing worth $1,000 or 1,000 things worth $1, right? And
Yeah,
where do you invest? Now, of course, I'd do that because I was the guy working on the tech that did the 1,000 things. But
right.
the point was always I felt pretty valid, right? And actually, even more so when I try and encourage people to think about different ways to solve different problems and where to invest, right? Because one of the interesting things is when you do these big heavy lifting projects and building applications or the world of process, then it's a lot of time, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of consultants, engineers, what have you. It's a lot of risk, right? And because of the scale of it, like we've learned over the years in the world of software, like you definitely run the risk that you don't get the payback, you don't get the ROI, that you fail to deliver against requirements. It took too long, right? By the time you were done, the world's moved on, especially the pace we're going at now. And then when you do the $1,001 problems, right? Like they're all pretty low risk. Maybe it takes a day, maybe it takes a week, maybe it takes a month to implement this thing. Pretty fast, pretty agile. You're close to the business when you're solving it, or you're in the business when you're solving it. And so there's always this argument of like, actually, if you solved 1,000 little problems, you would probably get the payback in your business to pay to take on the big, sort of hairy, risky one, right? So like, if you think about then stepping back and saying, okay, well, there's big problems, there's mid-sized problems, there's small problems, there's people with skills to solve these ones, people with skills or expertise, potentially more closer domain knowledge to solve these ones. Like if I'm out there trying to pick a technology stack or figure out what people to allocate to projects or decide how to prioritize different efforts, like what have you seen in terms of the best practices around that, right? Is it like, oh, I'm going to get one technology and rationalize everything on that stack, and that's my big bet as a company, or is it something different?
I want to acknowledge the elephant in the corner and then answer your question, right? So
Yeah.
the elephant in the corner is I can get 1,000. If I can get $1 each from 1,000 different people in my organization, I have to convince them to participate, right? So I think that's the elephant in the corner. I've just finished reading a book that I'm going to write a forward to. I loved it. I can't wait to recommend it when it's live. But one of the things in this book that really struck me was a spider graph, and in the spider graph, it was around readiness, and you saw technology, and it's way out here, and architecture, it's way out here. And then people and support and change management are right there in the center, right? So
Yep.
so that's the problem, right? I mean, we've talked about this a lot during the course of the podcast. You've been involved in creating some products that are really pretty business user accessible, but they're not getting embraced to the extent that they need to. So let's sort of say let's put that
Yep.
over here. Let's pin this and say change management is probably going to be, the biggest challenge. Teaching those 1,000 speedboats, you all have to work in unison and be a part of this, even though it's not part of your job description today. So let's
Yep.
kind of put that off to the side and pin that and say I've crossed that magical bridge. So in my mind, I need something that can handle the most sophisticated applications, right? The sort of classic world of, Pega, Appian, Camunda. I tend to think in process. Obviously, ServiceNow, Mendix, OutSystems are kind of encroaching into that area, even in the process-centric area. But they're all sort of handling sophisticated, mission-critical applications. All that stuff is really good. How far downstream can I take that? I don't know. Let's figure out what the governance model is, and let's figure out what the change management model is. And let's figure out, do we have the IT resources to take those things downstream? On the other end, I need something that enables those folks to say, I've got a problem with a minimal amount of training. I can build something that addresses that problem. Maybe have a little bit of IT support or something through some sort of COE if I get stuck. And on that side of the world lives, Nintex, QuickBase, BettyBlocks, KissFlow. There's a lot of them, but maybe I do what you said earlier and start to slide in some collaborative work management tools into that end of the spectrum, right? And then sort of, where does the middle live, right? What lives in the middle, right? So can I take those things upstream? I know that was a big goal of yours, in running product, was to be able to take those things upstream and have them handle more sophisticated applications, and they undoubtedly can. Or do I take those other applications and take them downstream? But ideally, I want the least number of products I can to be able to handle process, data-centric applications, simple things that a business user can handle on their own, all the way up through sophisticated applications. Can I do that if I can do that with 3 products, some mix thereof, and define the boundaries through a well-defined governance model, I'm pretty happy. The one thing I would say is, and people are not super happy with me when I say this, I think we have to start thinking about standardization, right? I think the days of 1,000 flowers bloom is over. If I'm going to teach 1,000 people how to be developers, I'm going to do it with a common training method, with common data access, with common security, with common design patterns and things like that. All this stuff is hard to figure out, and the least number of times I have to do it, the more I can scale the program.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting having been on the vendor side for a long time, right? Like, and looking at competitive landscape, you sort of, you have that aspirational CIO wants just one platform to do all the stuff, right? Where you're like, it's never going to happen, right? Let's be real, especially in larger. I mean,
unless you're a full-on Microsoft shop.
Yeah, I mean,
it kind of does happen sometimes, right?
Right. It's. I mean, there's this sort of is there tech that would claim to or purport to do all the things, right? Like, has process mining, has this, has RPA, has DPA, has database thing, has look, the sort of Power Platform, yes, checks all the boxes. UiPath mostly checks all the boxes. Nintex, those are sort of the 3 big companies and Appian, Pega to an extent, who've tried to amass the capabilities, right? So there's stuff that can do this, but back to your point, right? Like, okay, those ones need devs in some capacity, or folks who've gone on pretty extensive training, right? So then you go, okay, So one's probably not going to do it. Three, to your point, I think aspiration, like, I've bought Power Platform, I've got like a Nintex, and I've got a Monday.com. Cool.
Right.
3, check. What I have noticed is, like, it's sort of almost like I've got one of these ones. I might have 3 of these ones. There's like a little exponential thing. And then trying to take someone who's, no, I love Trello. And you're like, yeah, but you can do that with Airtable. It's like, no, Trello. And most of the time I see in CWM, companies will have a few of them, like marketing loves this tool and product loves that tool and what have you, which doesn't seem like a bad thing, right? Like, I mean, you can rationalize those, or you can just say, hey, I think that's a breeding ground for someone in the, to your governance model. Someone in there should always just be looking and saying, how's this going? Are there things here that we should move up the food chain, right? Because I was having this conversation just the other week with someone with the whole, what if I take a low code platform and get stuck, right? Like, I realize I have to rebuild it with code eventually. And you're like, to me, that's a good thing. Like, you've probably by then proven, like, you understand what you're trying to do, right? You've taken a minimum viable product approach to it. And then, like, now you have your requirements to go build something more complex, and you've de-risked that project, right? Like, so it's like figuring out what that collection is. But then, you and I talked a little bit earlier about this in the day, right? Like, some of this boils down to what people do you have, what availability do you have as well, right? Because there's no perfect, pick this kind of platform for this app, right? Some of it's going to be the combination of maybe where your team's based in the world, what skills do they have, how many projects have they taken on, like, what do you I mean, is that what you see when people start thinking center of excellence? Is that typically where you start to see this come into play?
Yeah, I mean, there is a tension, and I said, I kind of started off with, people get mad at me for when they see standardization. Back when we spoke in front of live audiences a lot more, I would always say, well, you have this huge need for automation. You've got to bring the business closer to the business. They go, yes. I say, and you're going to have to start thinking about standardization and using body language. Everybody
No,
using
don't take my product away from me.
and you're to your point, you're probably not going to get there. It's something I think that you strive for, right?
Right.
And the vendors are very clever to sort of say, well, why would you not want to go after that, right? So you're always striking this, you're always kind of striking this balance. You're always open to new tools coming into the organization. You probably are trying to establish some new patterns, right? So I would argue that I would prefer that the low code application not hit a wall and fail.
Right.
It's a good thing. A better thing would be if I deployed it into production and it worked.
And it scaled and magic happened. Yeah.
But one of the things, Ryan, that you kind of teed up there that I think is really important is, well, is it okay if it fails? Well, yeah, because we actually have done a fundamentally different job of establishing what the requirements were for that application and establishing the value of that application. And we did it collaboratively with the business, which is, one of the hallmarks of these businesses. So, getting back to the elephant in the corner, I would love people to start thinking in those ways, right? To being able to experiment with technology iteratively in order to establish, requirements and start small and build out bigger. Ideally, never hit a cliff, but even if you do, you're fundamentally bringing the business closer into the development process, which I think is a big thing. But getting back to the standardization, conversation, there are lots of reasons why I want to have the least number of products that I can in my organization. I'm probably more willing to have 5 or 6 collaborative work management products running around, as long as I know that they're there and I'm sure about their security and privacy, etc. Than I would to have 5 or 6 folks who are handling those those top end sophisticated applications. I'd really like to winnow that down. And by the way, especially if I'm going to bring it downstream down to the medium complexity application.
Which speaks to, it's the age old, we've been around long enough, right, to have lived through
so long.
Hey, best of breed versus get everything from IBM or Oracle or Microsoft or what have you. So is there a bit of that conversation here, right? It's like, when's the single stack provider like a Microsoft or UiPath the right approach here versus no, look, Nintex is really good at process, QuickBase is really good at databases, FormStack is really good at digital forms, and I've got a specific need in that area that this one's just better catered to. Or we've been talking a bit recently with Wavemaker, right, where their real focus is more of the consumer facing apps, which is not common in the low code world, right? The low code world has historically been internal apps. So like, is that the yeah, how should people be thinking about that as part of this standardization conversation? Is it like, is it get to that one and it's the platform, or is it more
We'll always
just
kind of make the joke that says, if Wavemaker finds himself in a deal against Kissflow, they're in the wrong place, right? So these things are really, and that's the thing I think that we get to do in the podcast. It's fun is to say to the vendors, where do you really fit, right? Where what is it that you are designed
everywhere? We do it all.
But they haven't said that. Not one vendor has said that.
That's right.
They've all been really candid, and they've all given some really pragmatic advice. This is what we do. We kind of don't do this other thing, right? So, so I think we've been very, very lucky, in that regard. So, if you've brought in Wavemaker, that's probably not part of your citizen developer program mindset, right? That's not where they live. And if you brought in Kissflow, you're probably not thinking about them for the most sophisticated consumer facing applications, right? So there are different things that that approach different pieces. So so you try to cover the waterfront that you can. These are the normal development patterns I have with IT, and these are areas where IT is willing to through the COE partner with the business to get to that long tail of automation, and this is how we think we can get to it most effectively. And then in comes vendor X, who says, we've built the coolest customer onboard or employee onboarding app you've ever seen, and it's all done and it's out of the box and integrates with all the things you need to integrate with. Can we buy it? No, it's not in our standards. Well, then are you going to build it for me? Because I can buy it from them, right? So we're always going to face those best of breed dynamics. But I do want to bring up a story which I think is relevant here. And it's around kind of the open source orchestration mindset. We're going to have Jacob Frond on from Camunda here in about a week. And it's around, this call that became increasingly common. So my data, when I was working at Forrester, I started seeing more and more interest in BPMN. I started seeing more and more interest in open source, right? These were things where the market for many years had said, I want to get it all from a single vendor. Do you have RPA? Do you have content management? Do you have decisioning capabilities? Do you have, anything I could need to build any type of application? And then all of a sudden I saw the pendulum go way back and say, the problem I need to solve is this thing called orchestration, right? Model something across heterogeneous technologies and human states with lots of integration points, maintain state, of that process over the course of that time. That's hard to do. Give me a solution that does that. I'll put in my RPA. I'll put in my content management system. I'll plug in the decisioning capabilities that we need. I'll do the integration or through some help with them to all of our back-end systems. That keeps me, able to adhere to our current standards. I don't have to bring in, new things because they're part of a big stack. That gives me the ability to swap things in and out through best of breed type of architectures. And I've got the technology skills to do it. So I don't think we're ever going to answer this best of breed versus bundle story. But I would say that as the market matured and people began to take automation more seriously, a lot of organizations did go back to that. Just solve that orchestration problem. I'll plug in everything else around it to meet my needs.
See, you bring up interesting. We to our discussion earlier before we jumped on here, Rob. We go like, can we get through this topic in half an hour? And the answer is no, right? But we're almost there. We're almost there. But you bring up a really interesting point that I think is a note for a future episode to start to explore. So best of breed, fine. Pure plays, fine. Orchestration, I've got this passion for orchestration, automation, similar but different, right? And where do they play? Your orchestration piece is really interesting because one of the things I think that few folks tend to think about in the space of low code and vendors in particular, I find is that there's the things people used to do historically with low code platforms. Go back 20 years, right? Where you say, there's just nothing out there that does what I need. I'm unique. I'm special. My process is different. So low code had that's the kind of the origin story of it, right? And custom apps as well. And then we fast forward to a world where SaaS is so prolific. It's so easy for anyone to start a company, get technology up and running, get it in the cloud, and focus on just the most niche domains, right? We're like, oh, I've got the SaaS that's for plumbers in the Pacific Northwest of America who service customer bases below 200 employees. And I do everything for them, right? And I came from that world and I've optimized. And all of a sudden, that's a use case for low code vendors just disappeared. And low code vendors, like their growth and their money comes from more use cases, right? And yet, at the same time, so proliferation of SaaS, but then more use of low code than ever before. Like in my time at Nintex, we were used more and more and more. To your point, like thousands, tens of thousands of processes automated on the platform by individual customers. And yet everybody's saying, but I've got all this amazing SaaS technology, right? So it's like I think there's a discussion for us to have there. We're not going to do it now or we'll be going for a long time, but like the overlay between low code and SaaS and orchestration in that regard to say like, okay, look, I've got all these SaaS platforms. Every SaaS platform has some flavor of workflow process in it, right? Like a Salesforce is a CRM, a Workday for human capital management. The problem with all those things is no one looks at what's happening across them, right? And so there's an interesting discussion there when you get into this, do I best of breed versus not versus whatever, is like, actually, how do you orchestrate at that higher level and make sure that things are really happening in, you know, from your customer's perspective, right? Which is always going to be the classic one. Because like, to your banking analogy, I don't care what's happening. I just need my credit card, right? And you're like, oh, but you don't understand. You see, it finished it's over in this system and it had to get to here. And actually that involved a piece of paper coming out of a fax machine, right, and hopefully it didn't fall on the ground and got picked up, right? Like, so
there's
a
manual white state that lives between all of my organizational boundaries, right? Because I've set up all these SaaS systems, or I've set up all these specific line of business systems, and I got more efficient. I hit my KPIs, I got a bonus, right? But nobody looked at the orchestration of this. So let's tee up this conversation for another time.
Yep.
And then can I tee up? I'll tee up a thing just because this really hit something I was working on earlier. So this book I've been reading is I won't share too much at the moment. It's called Enterprise. Let me make sure I get the name correct. It's called Enterprise Process Orchestration, and this is exactly the topic that they hit on: cross organizational processes and how do you span them, because that's where the real transformation is going to have to take place. So we'll tee it up for another time, see if we can get the author to come on the podcast.
Fantastic. Well, Rob, great discussions. It's fun to have one where it's just the two of us. Love having the guests on as well, but it's always good when we just get the opportunity to bounce the ideas around, and hope it's been valuable for the audience, and looking forward to bringing on a few more vendors now. We've got some interesting stuff in the hopper that some people I think everyone's going to really enjoy hearing from. So it's great to catch up, and look forward to the next one.
Yeah, for sure. And so just for the audience, if you stuck with us for 38 minutes, we had promised we would bring on Jacob Fraun from Camunda, and we had just a whole scheduling debacle through vacations and things. He'll be our next guest. We're going to get him in studio here shortly. So thank you.
Fantastic.
Or maybe 2 guests out now. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Bye.